Do you ever wish you had more control? Maybe next year's financial aid isn't quite certain, or maybe you're not sure what's going to happen after graduation, or maybe you see someone else hurting and you feel helpless to do anything about it. My guess is that each of us has at least one area in our life where we really, really want to be in control. And it often seems like it's those situations where we most want to be in control that it seems like we're spinning out of control all the time. Is this a cruel trick of nature? Or could it be that God has something to teach us in these situations? I came face to face with my own desire for control while I was working at camp this summer. One of my campers, a little girl who I'd grown to love very much, shared some things about her life at home that warranted a call to Child Protective Services. I was consumed with fear the rest of that week. I really didn't want to send her back to that situation, and it seemed like CPS wasn't doing anything. And even if they did remove her from the home, who knew where she would end up? I had a lot of really, really good ideas about how this situation ought to end. And I told God about all of them, and he didn't seem to be taking my advice. I shared my frustrations with a fellow staff member, and she challenged me to give this situation to God, to trust that he loves this little girl more than I ever could, and that he was taking care of her, no matter what happened. That same day I read these verses from Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. My thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, says the Lord. And my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. Just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. This was absolutely not what I wanted to hear. If I was being really honest with myself, what I wanted to hear was God saying, okay, Whitney, good idea, I'll do it your way. Or better yet, here are 3 surefire steps that you can take to protect your camper. Instead, he said, I know better than you. You only see right now, but I see the whole picture. Trust me. It was hard to hear, and even harder to accept. But it was absolutely what I needed to hear. And it's what I want you to remember today. God knows everything. He's so much more able to take care of any situation in our lives, and he is more faithful than we could ever be. Trust him. When we seek control, I think what we're really after is a feeling of security. We want to feel certain that everything's going to work out just so. So we try and manipulate the situation so that it works out the way we want it. If you want something done right, you got to do it yourself, right? We really live by that a lot of the time. And when we find that for some reason or another we can't do it ourselves, we panic. Because that fragile feeling of safety has been taken away from us. This brings me to my first point. Our feeling safe doesn't really have anything to do with how safe or secure we actually are. Let me illustrate. As some of you may know, I am in the GFU production of Thoroughly Modern Millie, which opens tonight, by the way. Come see it. Anyway, there's a lift in the opening number that one fellow has to pick me up by the waist, and then he sets me on the shoulders of 2 other fellows in the cast, and I go, wee, no hands! I'm afraid of heights, too. I didn't think it was possible for me to do this at all. The first time we tried it, I was sitting up there wobbling, trying to find some sense of balance. And then the fellow behind me, who had originally, lifted me up to set me on the shoulders of the other 2 guys, says, just lean back. Are you crazy? No, if you lean back, then I can kind of prop you up and make sure you don't fall. Well, leaning back was kind of scary because I can't see that he's back there at all. And it wasn't really what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was lean forward because that's where I'm most in control. But I couldn't find my balance. It was a lot better for me to give up the control that I really didn't have in the first place and just trust, even though leaning back is significantly scarier. In the same way, we're much safer trusting God than we are trying to keep it together on our own. Quick clarification. Trusting God isn't an excuse for laziness. If God has in fact enabled us to act in a situation, we absolutely ought to do so. In the case of my camper, for example, it would have been completely wrong for me to say, God will take care of it, so I don't need to make this call to CPS. See, our own efforts, though, even though they're important, a lot of times they're not enough. And our struggle for control over something that we really don't have any control over can only lead to worry and fear. Trusting in God, on the other hand, can turn into praise and prayer and peace and meaningful action. In Exodus 3, we see an example of someone striving for control that wasn't his. God tells Moses in the encounter at the burning bush that he has seen the suffering of his people in Egypt and that he's sending Moses to get them out. In verse 13, it says, "But Moses protested, 'If I go to the people of Israel and tell them the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them then?'" In years past, I've read this passage and thought that Moses was just trying to make an excuse or change the subject. But our friend Irv shared a new insight with me earlier this year. In Hebrew culture, knowing someone's name gives you a certain amount of control over that person. Moses may have been thinking that having the kind of power that can set a bush aflame without burning it up would be really handy to have at his beck and call. His question was an attempt to gain control. This gives a new light to God's answer to him. In verse 14, God replied to Moses, "I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." In essence, God is telling Moses, I am who I am. I will be who I will be. You can't control me, but I will be with you. You don't have to be afraid. This is my second point. We can't control God, so we have to trust his heart. Let's look at another fellow in the Bible who learned about trusting God. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh. In chapter 12, verses 8 through 10, he says, 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, my grace is enough for you. My power works best in your weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses, and in the insults and hardships, persecutions and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. We don't know exactly what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. The imagery is pretty vivid. It tells us that it was a continual pain to him. Paul wasn't able to remove this thorn by himself. And because of that, the thorn forced him to rely on God's grace. He had to learn to trust that God's strength would be enough, that it would work in his weakness. This is my third point. The struggles in our lives can be seen as an invitation to trust God. It doesn't sound to me like trusting God came very easily or naturally to Paul. I imagine he continued to struggle with this, at least to some degree, for the rest of his life. And I'm pretty sure I will continue to be challenged with this idea of trusting God for all of my life. But we can also learn to rejoice in the learning process. The next time you feel like the world is spinning out of control, be excited. Who knows what heights of faith God may lead you to through this challenge.